Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this second appointment of the UNICC Webinar Series. I'm Ilaria Aiello, a learning assistant at the United Nations International Computing Center. And for those of you who are attending this event for the first time, I'd like to mention that this initiative will see a series of monthly one-hour webinars. We will stop only next month in August to restart in September. And these webinars will be on several topics related to digital technologies with the scope of promoting digital insights in line with the UN 2.0 vision. Today's webinar will be focused on data-driven techniques for managing supply chain security risk. And I'm pleased to give the floor to my colleague Carlos Alexandre, a cybersecurity officer at the UNICC. He will be the subject matter expert for this session. So during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat to post your questions. And at the end, Carlos will be more than happy to answer as many questions as possible. In case we don't have enough time to cover all questions, we will attach all questions and related answers to an email that will be broadcasted to all of you together with a link to the recording to this session. Okay, Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I hope you all can see my screen. So hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar about data-driven techniques for managing supply chain cybersecurity risks. So it's my pleasure sharing with you my thoughts around this topic and also some best practices that some UN agencies are adopting and also more in general. So let's get started. So before diving into the topic, let's do a bit of introduction. So my name is Carlos Alexandre. I'm Cybersecurity Officer at UNICC. I have 13 plus years of experience in the UN system, and I have been supporting several UN organizations developing and implementing their cybersecurity program. Also, I'm leading the risk management service at UNICC and supporting other UN organizations on this practice. Okay, so let's go now to the topic. Okay, so the ICT supply chain. So as we all know, with the digital transformation and the increased adoption of cloud services, and also now with the AI tools, the number of ICT suppliers and third parties are growing exponentially. In addition, many UN organizations manage highly sensitive data, which in some cases are related to vulnerable groups, beneficiaries, children, and other type of sensitive data, right? Therefore, we are entrusting this sensitive data in all these third parties. So it's key that we do our due diligence and we manage this risk properly. On top of that, UN organizations operate with a wide range of providers, from local to international ones, and both of them are equally important, right? So local providers are equally important to the international ones in order to fulfill our mandate, okay? So failing to implement an adequate third-party risk management practice could lead to data breaches and service disruption, resulting in operational, reputational, financial, safety, and security issues for our organization and for its users, right? So business disruption is if we are not able to provide services or deliver our mandate, we can have reputational damage and loss of trust from our member states, from our donors, from our users in our mandate. We may have financial issues if we need to run incident response, if we need to run forensic analysis, if we have claims from our users or litigation. So all this will incur in some financial issues, and of course, safety and security related issues if PII data is disclosed, in particular from vulnerable people, which may put their life at risk. So again, not properly managing ICT supply chain can have severe consequences to our organizations. So we know that the impact could be very high if we don't manage this properly, but what about the likelihood of this happening, right? And here I have put some statistics to give you more context on the current ICT cyber supply risk landscape. So first one, according to Security Scorecard, 98 of the organizations have a relationship with a third party that has been breached. So this is a very big number. At least 29% of the total breaches were attributable to a third-party attack vector. So we know that it's an important attack vector. 41% of the organizations that suffer a material incident in the past 12 months say that a third party caused it. Around 50% of attacks are attributable to APT groups or well-known attacker. So they are getting advantage of third parties because they can reach more systems, more data, more customers, right? So as it is mentioned in the last item, threat groups have increased their interest in supply chain attacks. And yeah, some of them are using employees as an entry point to break our third party partners. So the number of third parties being used by the organization continue to increase and increase and increase. So this is a figure, an image of the number of apps that are integrated in Google Workspace by company size. So if you have any of these SaaS monitoring solutions that monitors the number of SaaS solutions that your users are being accessed or that they are connected to your identity system, you will see that this is massive. So it's increasing and increasing. So this poses a high risk to us, right? And we need to manage it properly. So let's now look at some real world examples that we all know to understand that this is happening more often than we would like. So the first one is about the MOVEit breach, right? And over 1,000 organizations and 60 million of individuals were affected by this third-party breach, right? So MOVEit is a file transfer program that is used by a wide range of organizations, public and private, to transfer more sensitive or personal data. A MOVEit was compromised and a malware was used to steal sensitive information from their database. Thereafter, the groups threatened companies that they were going to publish their files or to leak their files or to leak their data if don't pay. Okay, so this is something that we all know it's happening and the impact is huge. Another one that happened recently, and it happened a couple of times, is about LastPass, the LastPass breach, right? And the issue here was that corporate laptop was compromised, right? That was the root cause. And I'm highlighting that because this information is very relevant for later to determine what are some of the key controls that we want to assess in our providers based on the current threat landscape that we have. So in this case, corporate laptop was compromised. Maybe the defenses on the laptop were not good, or maybe the laptop was not centrally managed and protection were not enforced at all. So we don't know, but the root cause is that laptop was compromised. So another case is the SolarWinds, right? So in this case, the attacker gained access to SolarWinds network, possibly by exploiting a zero-day vulnerability, a brute force attacks, compromising the device, or through social engineering. And after the compromise, a malicious software was injecting in the Orion build process, right? And this was downloaded to the customers, and then they were able to steal information. Here there is a reference at the bottom, which again is very relevant, right? Is the ENISA Threat Landscape Report for Supply Chain. So we can also look at what are the current threats and what are the current risk landscapes, so we can adapt our assessment to tackle the current threats and risks. And the last one is a very recent one with a very big impact. You all know is the CrowdStrike incident, right? It was not a cybersecurity incident, but doesn't matter. The impact to the operations was huge, was very big. Okay, so as you can see, these third-party breaches are happening more and more. Likelihood is high, so we need to be ready and put in place a framework to manage this risk. So how can we manage this risk? How can we manage the ICT supply chain? First of all, we need to put in place an effective third-party risk management practice, which is essential to maintain our due diligence, right? And we need to conduct vendor security risk assessments based on relevant data. And this is why I'm emphasizing all these threat landscape report or risk report. So we can take this relevant data and do and perform relevant analysis based on that, okay? So the business can make risk-informed decisions about whether they want to continue or start with a certain supplier or not. So what is next, right? So we said that we need to implement an effective third-party risk management practice. So we need a standard approach, right, or process to assess the vendors, to identify potential risks, to manage them. And yeah, the process at high level may look like this figure, right? So here you can see the main phases or the main activities or steps for the third-party risk management process. So the first one is key, it's very important, is about establishing a policies and related procedure, right? So this will set up the ground of our framework, and we need to define things like setting the criteria to categorize our vendors, right? Following always a risk-based approach. So we need to determine and to classify our vendors based on a criteria. The criteria could be something simple, like do they have access to sensitive data, yes or no, or are they used to perform business critical operations, yes or no, or do they have access to our network, yes or no, and based on that we will come up with a categorization, right? And again, the different levels or tiers of this categorization could be simple, like having critical suppliers versus non-critical suppliers, or we can be a little bit more advanced, having different tiers for the different categories of our vendors. So that will depend, of course, on the level of maturity that our organization has. So as usual, we should go one step after the other and increase our maturity level. So as I said, things like having a categorization of our vendor is key to run a risk-based approach to this process, right? Because based on that, then we will determine which are the level of the due diligence that we need to perform. Do we need to perform a very comprehensive risk assessment for this particular vendor? If it's a critical one, for sure, yes. But if it's not that critical one, maybe we just need a light due diligence, a light risk assessment, and we don't need that comprehensive one, right? So again, everything follows a risk-based approach here, but we need to define it. We need to have it in a policy, in our process, and we need to get agreement between all the different stakeholders in our organization to agree on that categorization, okay? We should also set, as part of this policies and procedure, establishing policies and procedure, we should also set what are our minimum requirements to be added also during the tender process and also at contractual level, right? And this is very important. Also, given the nature of the UN, we have our privilege and immunities, which should be considered always and should be added into the contract. So all these things will be also defined at the policy level. And also one other thing that you may want to consider to define when you establish the policies and the related procedures is the frequency that you may want to perform the review of your suppliers, right? So we know that, for instance, that for critical suppliers, you want to do a very deep risk assessment. But on top of that, we need to review them on regular basis, right? Because maybe their risk profile has changed. So in that policy, we should define also that, for instance, critical suppliers, they should review on annual basis, while non-critical suppliers, they can be reviewed at the contract renewal, something of this sort, right? That will depend, of course, on the maturity level, but we need to define that at the policy level. And then if we move to the next phase, the vendor procurement. So again, here collaboration is key, right? Because security should be part of the procurement process. So we can add all the necessary security requirements into the tender process, the RFP, the scope of work. Security requirements such as, if having ISO 27701 certification related to information security, or 27701 certification related to data protection and privacy. If this is mandatory, if it's considered optional, but it will be like an asset when we do the evaluation of the supplier, all these sort of requirements should be defined in the tender process. So the suppliers, they know well in advance, right? And they can also comply to our requirements. Of course, one of the requirements that are important are the certifications if we want to get assurance, and also this SOC 2 Type 2 report. They are also interesting if we want to get higher assurance for our critical suppliers or vendors. Then the third step here of phase will be the actual risk assessment and due diligence, right? And I will not expand a lot here, because in the coming slides we will talk about this. But this is where we actually do the assessment of the vendor, and we also make our recommendations. Then, if all is okay, we will move to the contracting part, right? And in the contracting part, we will need to make sure that the security requirements, security clauses are added into the contract, right? And also we need to make sure that our service level agreements are properly documented and agreed with the vendor. And again, this is quite important. And also there are things to take into consideration when we engage or when we are contracting with a cloud provider. We all know that there are challenges sometimes with the big ones, and it's key to manage this properly. This phase is key to manage it properly, so we can get our security requirements properly in place in the contract. Then the next one is about regular monitoring, audit, and review. As I said, at policy level, we need to define what are the frequency that we will review our suppliers based on the category, following a risk-based approach, and then actually at certain frequency we do the regular review monitoring, okay? And if for any reason we identify new risk or the risk profile has changed, we need to inform the business, right? So they can take appropriate actions. And finally, last but not last, we have the vendor offboarding, which all the activities are keys, but this one is also key. So we need to make sure that when we exit a vendor, we take our data with us, right? So we export our data, we keep our data. Then we may want to consider also that the provider securely removes our data after we export it. And also we need to ensure that any type of access is properly revoked if that is the case, okay? So vendor offboarding, also very critical piece of activity that we need to take into account. Now, data-driven vendor security risk assessment, right? So we're talking about one phase, one stage, which is about risk assessment and due diligence. So in order to do this properly, we need to collect relevant data, analyze this data, and based on that data, make risk-informed decisions, right? So our business knows the risk and can take the adequate actions. So how this would look like, how this vendor risk assessment process would look like. So this is an example, okay, of a data-driven vendor security risk assessment. So the process is quite simple. So the first step would be to collect the vendor security assurance report, right? Again, this will be based on the categorization of our suppliers and based on the due diligence that we have determined for that particular supplier. But thinking that this is a normal or a critical supplier, I would say that first we need to collect vendor security assurance report, okay? Like SOC 2 Type 2, ISO 27001, penetration test, business continuity test. So these are also important sort of reports that we should take into consideration, not only the SOC 2 Type 2 report or the ISO 27001 certificate and similar ones, but penetration test and business continuity test, they provide also good insights on the security posture of the vendor, right? So if the vendor doesn't have security assurance report, then we need to share with them our vendor security questionnaire. And in the coming slides, we will see what are some of the best practices on selecting the right questions for the vendor security questionnaire. Then we may want to collect, and this is a good practice, data from other sources, right? So if we are subscribed to a security risk rating platform, we can take also insights from that security risk rating platform. We also need to, and this is key, to know if there has been any recent past security breach on this vendor, and if that's the case, if the incident was properly addressed at root cause, and also to take any other relevant data that is publicly available, right? So based on that, based on all this data that we have collected from assurance report, from our security questionnaire, from information publicly available from security risk rating platform, then we analyze all this data collected and we assess the vendor security practices, okay? If required, and this is something that I would recommend for critical vendors, it's good to have an interview with the vendors to get additional information or clarification. And this is sometimes a good practice, right? Because when you start to talk with a vendor, when you challenge some of the answers that they provide and you start interacting with them, then you realize you can get a feeling of their real security posture. So again, I would recommend that whenever there is a critical supplier, is a good practice to have a quick chat with them, interview with them, challenge some questions, challenge some answers, and then you will get a better view of their security posture. Based on all this analysis, we should identify security risks and also mitigation, right? We should propose some recommendations on how to mitigate these security risks. And we will see later on what are the different options that we have when we go to risk treatment or mitigation. Finally, based on this analysis, we'll produce a report, right, for our business, for our stakeholders on the overall vendor rating. I think it's a good thing to have, like having an overall vendor security rating. It could be A, B, C, D, or it could be in another sort of form, but it's very visual and very understandable for the business if we have an overall vendor risk rating. And also very important, which are the identified risk and recommendations that we have to mitigate the risk. And we should share that with the business. Now, what are the challenges in all these processes in the third-party risk management process as an overall, but also on the vendor security risk assessment in particular? So what are the challenges? So as we know, it's a very heavy process and very time-consuming. There is a lot of back and forth communication, a lot of waiting time, a lot of confusion if we use questionnaires with Excel files and you need to share via email and so forth. So it's very heavy process. Also, the time to complete the assessment is very, very long. You know that sometimes it could take up to 8 weeks. So this is something also this is one the biggest challenge that we have as well, right? The time to complete. Then the next one, collecting accurate data for the analysis is challenging sometimes because we share very long questionnaires with our suppliers and they take time to complete it, and sometimes the information is not very meaningful. Or other times, maybe small suppliers, they don't have assurance report in terms of SOC 2 or ISO penetration test, so it's really difficult to get accurate information, right? And one thing that I always recommend is that whenever possible to look at this SOC 2 and ISO report, penetration test report, and all that, because they are they have been audited by independent parties, right? So someone already went there and did their independent audit, so it's something that someone has tested. While if we exchange our security questionnaire, that is more of a self attestation questionnaire, which sometimes might not be 100% accurate, right? So best practices, wherever possible, is to look at the SOC 2 Type 2 report. Then you can complement, of course, with security questionnaire for any gaps or any security requirements that maybe are not in the SOC 2 Type 2 report. Then you can, of course, send them a security questionnaire, but assurance is given in the SOC 2 Type 2 report. The security questionnaire are self-attestation. Then additional challenge that we have is unresponsible vendors, and also that process and unresponsible vendors. Before I move to the next one, it happens oftentimes if we have a contract already in place with the vendor, right? So if the contract is already in place, then it's more challenging, right? You don't get the same response as if you are in the initial pre-contracting phase, where you have more chances that they will reply on time so they can get the contract on time. And finally, process not integrated with other key processes like procurement. And this is, again, key that we integrate our process with the procurement process. All these challenges may result in not enabling our business partners as quick as they need, right? Because sometimes assessment take too long to complete. There's a lot of back and forth with the supplier and all that. So we are not enabling our business in a way. Of course, another issue is that the ICT supply cyber risk maybe is not properly assessed, right? Because we don't have meaningful data, or we are not asking the right questions to the supplier, okay? And last one, we are not helping our partner suppliers neither, right? So sometimes if we send like 300 questions to them and they are not very relevant or necessary, we are not helping them. So some of them, they are small, they are local, but they are our partners. We need them, right, to enable our mandate. So it's important, I think, that sometimes we help them, we ask them the right questions. And if for whatever reason they are not meeting our security requirement, we help them again to meet them, right? So this is something also that I think we need to consider. Okay, so some best practices to improve all this process. So in a specific to establishing a policy and procedure, so as I said, we need to develop and agree with all the stakeholders a vendor security policy and a standard approach to classify and assess our suppliers, right? We have already mentioned it, but this is key to have a categorization which is based on risk. And then based on the categorization, we do our due diligence, we do our assessment, okay? So this is something to consider and not to consider, to take into account. Then we need to integrate vendor security assessment in the procurement process and supplier management process. So we have an end-to-end process, right? We are not ad hoc, or we are not called later when the service is already in production, which, as we all know, this also happens. So the service provider is already providing the service, and then we are called to perform the assessment. So we still do the assessment, but we are not as effective as if we are called, as we are injected at the beginning of the process. So we can add more value to the business, and we can do better our risk assessment. So set a criteria to categorize suppliers following a risk-based approach. Define for each category the level of due diligence required for both the initial assessment, the initial evaluation of the supplier, and also the ongoing regular review. So we need to define, based on the category, what is the level of due diligence that we want to do. Also, it's important to align with our enterprise risk management framework. So the risks that we identify and evaluate in the assessment are evaluated in the same way as the business does, but more important, whoever reads it reads and understand the same way, right? So we should use same levels, same understanding, same wording, same evaluation as we use on the enterprise risk management framework, and same impact, right? If we say that it's a high risk, it's because there is a high impact to the organization. We shouldn't look locally, but we should align with enterprise risk management framework. So we all understand the same in terms of risk level. Then, as I said, end-to-end process, this is key, including assessment, treatment, and regular monitoring and review of the risks and suppliers. And once the process is defined, of course, we need to, and this will go with the maturity level, we need to integrate with tool, automated workflows, and all this sort of process so we can optimize our process, right? But first we need to establish a well-defined process, and then we can integrate and automate and use different tools and workflows to perform this process. Some more best practices, but now in a specific to the vendor procurement phase, is that we already talked about it, but when assessing the needs for new ICT solutions, security and data protection functions, and of course also legal, needs to be consulted to ensure that their needs are considered as part of the requirements, right? So in the tender specification, we need to incorporate any security requirement that we may have in terms of security certifications, other security requirement, based of course on the criticality of the system or data, so the suppliers know well in advance. And the last bullet point is about always considering the UN privilege and immunities and the data hosting location, right? So this is very important. So we should define where we want to host our data where possible, and also considering adding UN privilege and immunities clauses in our contracts. Now, if we move to the next phase, some of the best practices when we do the risk assessment and our due diligence. So for critical suppliers, as we discussed, I think it's key to collect audit reports and technical assessments rather than self-attestation questionnaires, right? Again, self-attestation questionnaires should be in addition, but shouldn't be the ground. We need assurance, and SOC 2 and other independent audits or reports, they can give us this assurance that an independent party has gone and has tested the security control. So again, analyzing SOC 2 Type 2 report, because usually it contains a good amount of data, right? It will allow us to analyze and assess the risk properly. Of course, depending on the supplier, you may find that the SOC 2 Type 2 report is more or less comprehensive, but usually they have a good amount of data that we can use to assess the risk. And also, as I mentioned, on top of the SOC 2 Type 2 report, we may need to share our security questionnaire or a limited version of our security questionnaire to gather additional information and controls not covered by the SOC 2 Type 2 report, right? So SOC 2 usually follows a very defined structure, and some of today's relevant controls might not be in the scope of the SOC 2 Type 2 report, so it's worth checking with the vendor if they have implemented them or not. Okay, very important, complete the vendor assessment before signing a contract. This is key, doing our risk assessment and due diligence before signing the contract in the pre-contractual phase. Otherwise, then is a little bit more challenging, right, to get responses and to take any actions to treat or remediate the risks. Now let's talk about the questionnaires, right? Which is important because oftentimes we will use it. So when questionnaires are used, my recommendation, based on my experience, is to keep the number of questions to a reasonable number. And I would say that a reasonable number is less than 50. We all know that there are sort of predefined security questionnaires like the SIC or SIC Lite or others, which are very lengthy, right? They are more than 300 questions or 150 questions. So this is, from my point of view, sometimes too much. Okay, considering also that sometimes we are engaging with local providers, right? So again, we need to facilitate their life. We need to do a proper assessment, but also get accurate data and facilitate their life. Okay, so again, recommendation would be to keep questions in the questionnaire to a reasonable number, less than 50. Then we should also think about whether we want to use open-ended questions or closed questions. And of course, having closed, from my point of view, but is anyone can have a different idea. So closed questions will facilitate the review. It could even automate the assessment or the review, because it will be sort of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, okay, to the different questions that we ask. But from my point of view, it will not give the same level of information if you add open-ended questions, right? So when you add open-ended questions, for sure it will take more time for you to analyze and assess, but you can really understand the logic behind and get more data to do a proper assessment, right? If you ask them to describe their process or to describe the logic behind this, then you really understand whether they have implemented properly or not, or you can get a better understanding rather than having a yes or no approach with a closed question. So usually I prefer having open-ended questions, but of course this is up to everyone. But it's something to consider, right? It's an interesting debate, open-ended versus closed question. Then the next one is to consider a data-driven approach to understand what are the key controls in terms of risk reductions to be included in the questionnaire by looking at the current cyber threat and risk landscape, right? And this is why I was mentioning at the beginning that it's important to understand what are the current threats. So we can add in our questionnaire what are the key controls that can mitigate the risk, right? So it's always good to look at this, right? So things like old policy passwords and legacy things doesn't make any sense nowadays, right? So we need to, again, in these less than 50 controls, we need to put relevant key control that reduce risk, right? And these are the next bullet points. Determine what are your key controls. Could be a multi-factor authentication, EDR, regular security testing, having managed device for all employees, encryption, having backups and having tests of those backups, etc. So you need to determine what are your key controls and add them to the questionnaire. And of course, whatever you decide is a key control, is good also to ask evidence. In your security questionnaires, on top of yes and no, you should ask some sort of evidence, right? So out of the 50, maybe you can consider 15 that are really key controls, and you may require an evidence for that. So this is also something to consider. Some more best practices is on the questionnaires is to avoid non-relevant questions that does not translate into tangible risk. Like, do you have firewalls? Nowadays, almost everyone has firewalls, but here, in order to assess the risk, what we need to understand is if the firewalls are properly managed, are access restricted, are ports closed, are firewall rules reviewed on regular basis, right? Because asking these sort of questions, I mean, it's like, do you have an asset inventory or a CMDB? Yes, most of the organizations have, but how accurate is this, right? So how accurate is the data that the IT inventory or the CMDB has? So these are some questions that I think they does not exactly translate into tangible risk, because there are these considerations that are very important. So some of them you may want to consider to not add them, or to write it in a different way so you get meaningful data. Then, as I said, having a chat with the vendor to ask questions and challenge some answers, I think this is a good practice. So you really get a sense of their security posture, and also using a platform to exchange questionnaire and other information with your vendor, so you can automate the process, you can scale up, and you can have better management of the information. I think this is quite important, because otherwise working with Excel file, emails, and all that at the end becomes unmanageable. And if you have hundreds of suppliers, then it's very difficult to keep track. So having a platform that allows to exchange questionnaire, additional information, and all that, I think it's a very good practice. Again, this will go with the maturity of each organization and the amount and number of suppliers or vendors that you may have. Now, talking about treatment and managing the identified risks. So, usually these are mitigated via contractual obligations or agreement with the supplier to mitigate it. So we find that they are not encrypting data, or they are not properly having anti-malware in the servers, or not doing penetration tests at regular basis. Whatever we identify as a gap that may translate into substantial risk, then we can suggest to treat this risk in the contract, right? So the vendor is in a way obliged to implement it. And sometimes you may have sort of policy exception or risk acceptance for a limited period of time, provided that the supplier committed to fix it, right? So not having a penetration test or something of this sort, maybe they commit to have it in 1 or 2 months. So this is something that you may want also to consider. Now, what about third-party risk rating services, right? So we have a lot of platforms nowadays that do a passive automated scan of our internet-facing services, not ours, of the internet-facing systems of everyone, suppliers and ours. So they provide good insights, but from my point of view, they should be complementary to our actual assessments, right? So it will be another input to take into consideration, similar to the SOC 2 Type 2 reports, similar to the security questionnaires if we send to them, or any other publicly available information, recent data breaches, and all that. So it's another input to take into consideration, but I wouldn't suggest to be the only input. I wouldn't recommend to be the only input. They provide good insight, but should be taken as another input. So when a good level of security assurance is required, best is to do a full vendor security risk assessment, analyzing data from different sources, as we have mentioned. But of course, we should follow always a risk-based approach. So maybe for low risk vendors, so we talk about the categorization, right? For those that they do not represent a big risk to the organization, maybe we can use this service to do our assessment. Is an option. Again, I would recommend to use it as complementary rather than the only source of truth. So we're getting to the end. So when we are contracting with the vendor, as we said, make sure that we review the contract with the supplier before signing it. Add your security requirements, which might not be part of the initial draft of the contract. Incorporate UN privilege and immunities clauses into a contract. When procuring cloud solutions, also you may want to consider special controls that are applicable to cloud service providers. And I know that there are some UN organizations that make a lot of effort reviewing these contracts with the service providers to make sure that all the security clauses are in place, so they are also covered security-wise, but also from legal perspective, right? But in addition to checking the clauses, security clauses at the contract level, I think that we need to do our due diligence, we need to do our checks, we need to do our risk assessment. Okay, for monitoring and review, as I mentioned, so review and monitor supplies on regular basis, following a risk-based approach, following our categorization that we have defined, and also we need to monitor the service level agreement with our vendors. When doing the vendor offboarding, make sure you recover your data. You may want to request the vendors to securely remove the data and get confirmation. If they have access to our infrastructure, make sure that you deprovision the access, and you can also do some sort of post-termination audit checks or validation on the supplier. This is the last slide, and it is about the ITIL before guiding principles. And I like always to keep these principles in mind where possible, because I think they are good to build a good framework and also to improve framework step by step. So these are the guiding principles. Focus on value. Very important. We need to focus on value. Start where you are. So let's start with what we have, and then we improve step by step. Progress iterative with feedback. Collaborate, very key in this process. We need collaboration with different stakeholders. Think and work holistically. Keep it simple and practical. This is always a very good best practice. And optimize and automate, right? Once you have a good process in place, then you can optimize and automate. So I like these principles, and I think they are also applicable on the third-party risk management practice. So yeah, I think that's all for this webinar on data-driven techniques for managing supply chain cybersecurity risk. Now maybe we have around 10 minutes for questions. So
thank you, Carlos, for your interesting presentation. We have a couple of questions in the chat. If you prefer, I can read them and you answer.
Please.
The first one is from Luisa. She's asking, does UNICC have a due diligence questionnaire template that can be shared?
We do have a questionnaire, a security questionnaire. I would need to check internally whether we can share it or not. But yeah, we do have it, and we follow some of these principles that I have mentioned, right? Keeping it short, keeping key controls, and all that. So yeah, we will check internally and get back to you.
The following question is, there is any plans for UNICC or any other UN community to vet vendors and share results with other UN agencies so that we don't need to duplicate the due diligence process?
Okay, very interesting question, Luisa. So yeah, we're building a service. In UNICC, we have a service that is called Common Vendor Security Assessment. And the overall idea is exactly that, right? To perform assessment, perform security vendor risk assessment, and share them with the subscriber of this service. So we gain economy of scale, and we don't need to repeat the same assessment multiple times for the different UN agencies, right? And also considering that a lot of UN agencies, they share the same provider, I think it makes sense what you said, and this is the service that we have in mind to build a common vendor risk assessment service where, again, someone can request an assessment and then we do it once, but we can share the results with the subscriber of the service. So yeah, we have that.
Okay, next question is from Dubravka. how often the security assessment needs to be revised, and what happens if there are security breaches on vendor side?
Okay, so how often the security assessment needs to be reviewed? For critical suppliers, best practice is every year, right? So on yearly basis. This is sometimes also matching the frequency of the SOC 2 Type 2 report or any other external audits like ISO or penetration tests that usually as best practice, they should be done on an annual basis. So for your key or critical suppliers, I would recommend doing it on an annual basis, right? Then, of course, this will be part of your policy, your vendor categorization and all that. But best practice, I would say critical suppliers on annual basis. Then if there is a security breach on the vendor side, this will be interesting, right? Because this will test if their controls are properly implemented. Their controls in terms of incident communication to you, right? So they should communicate the incident in timely manner, and then you should get a communication frequency on that side. And then from your side, you need to make sure that when you need to do the assessment again, and what I would recommend is that you make sure that issues, you need to analyze what was the root cause of the issue to see if there was a big gap, but also more important that they have taken the necessary actions to mitigate this issue at the root cause, right? So this is something that we need to look at it when a vendor has a security breach. We need to understand how they have responded to it, right? And how they have fix it at root cause. Okay, so these are the two things that I would look when a vendor has a security breach.
Thank you, Carlos. So far, we don't have any other question in the chat. Let's give just a few seconds more in case something else is written. Otherwise, we can close the session. Anyway, we will give you the contacts, to reach in case you have additional questions after the webinar. Okay, I think that's it for today. We can close the session. Carlos, thank you again for your time, your availability to deliver this webinar. And thank you everyone for attending. And as said at the beginning, in August, we will stop with the series, but we will meet again in September with a new interesting topic. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Goodbye.